Hey everyone, my name is Dom. Welcome to On-Chain Rust, where we talk about all things Rust and blockchain. Today we are going to be continuing with the Substrate tutorials, and we are going to be customizing our runtime by adding a pallet to it, building it, and then running the blockchain locally and interacting with the new pallet we just added. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, actually, first I want to say that, I'm new to Rust, and I am really interested in blockchain, and I'm also interested in Rust. And so in order to learn a lot of these newer blockchain technologies, Rust, is a must. So I'm going through this process, but I am new. So I am coming to this from the perspective as someone who is, I am technical, I'm a software engineer, but I'm also a beginner at both of these things. So I'm going to be trying to dive in a little bit deeper into areas where I initially had questions that I think will be beneficial to you, since I assume you're in the same boat as me, or even maybe you're not so technical, but I'll at least try to keep it as simple as I can without confusing things. And so therefore, hopefully with whatever I tell you, it'll be helpful to you. And then if you want to learn more, kind of where to start digging and which questions to ask. So that's kind of what I'm aiming for, because that's where I'm coming from. So there will be some topics in here that are a little bit on the advanced side, I would say, for Rust, but it's not going to prevent you from doing the tutorial. And it also hopefully will lead to more questions, which will deepen your understanding. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started now. So if you go to the Substrate website, and this has changed a little bit since the last tutorial we did, but there is a developers menu up here. You just click on the home link, and down here there's a tutorial section, and then under tutorials there's this work with pallets area, and then the first one there says add a pallet to the runtime. That's the one we're going to be doing today. And so the first step before you actually can do this tutorial is to have set up your dev environment and to be able to build and run a Substrate node locally. We did that in the last video I have, so you can go ahead and watch that first if you haven't done that already. Or you can run through the tutorial here, which is this, the link here actually takes you to the tutorial and it gets all that set up for you. So, whatever is easier for you, but you have to have that done first before we continue with this. So, the palette we're going to be using today is called the Nix palette. And what it does is it associates a nickname with an account on the blockchain. So basically you reserve a name by making a deposit, you get that name, and then if you want to remove the name, you get your deposit back, or you can force remove the name and you don't get your deposit back. So it's basically for demonstration purposes. That's the whole point of this palette. So, and these are the three functions that we just kind of talked about: set name, clear name, and kill name. There's actually one more that we'll see in the code. And so what we're going to be doing is we are going to be adding the dependency to our cargo.toml file, which is the Nix palette. So we're going to add that palette dependency to our cargo.toml file. Then we're going to configure the config trait on the Nix palette. So for all the palettes that you add to your runtime, they all have to implement this config trait. And the config trait is a way for you to configure and customize how the palette will work. Now, all different palettes have different config traits. I think there's some core things that you have to implement, like event, or it's a runtime event now. But the creator of the palette will declare what the config trait is, and then you have to go ahead and assign some concrete types to that. So we'll get into that, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And then once that's done, we just add the palette to the construct runtime macro, and then we can build and run our Substrate node locally, and then we can interact with it with the Substrate front end, which is exactly what we'll do. All right, so as I said, the first part is adding the Nix Pallet dependency. And so one thing to understand is when you're dealing with Substrate, it's going to build both a native binary and a WASM binary for the runtime. And the WASM binary does not come with the standard feature set, basically the standard library for Rust. So we have to actually tell it to. So that's another step we'll do, which I'll show you here in a minute. So when we add the dependency here, this line here, we're going to open up our cargo.toml file under the runtime source directory. I'm sorry, just under the runtime directory. So to be very specific, it is your it's under your repository root directory, and then under runtime you have a cargo.toml file. Okay. And so in here you have this dependency section, and then you have a bunch of dependencies listed here. You'll see a bunch of different pallets here as well. So we are going to add the Nix pallet here. And there's a couple different properties. One is the version that we're specifying for the pallet. The second is this default features, which you can notice they all are set to false because we're actually going to define this under the feature section below. Then there's the Git repository, which tells Cargo where to go get this this package, and then the branch on which it should retrieve the package. So we're on, for this tutorial, we're on Polkadot 0.9.28. And that's what you'll see here on the web page as well. So I just copied this line and pasted it in here. Okay. So now we've added the Nix palette to our dependencies. And then the next step is to add the Nix palette to the features. So you'll see this STD. So basically this is saying for all of these packages in here, let's add the standard feature set. So we're going to do the same for the Nix palette. And then we're going to go ahead and save that. And what we can do here is just to make sure everything's cool, we can do a cargo check -p, and then we give it the package name we want it to build, which is the node template runtime. So I think I've mentioned this before, but cargo.check is just a faster way to compile the code. It doesn't actually build any of the binaries, so it runs a little bit faster than cargo build. Actually, it runs a lot faster than cargo build. Because at least on my machine, it's pretty slow to build things. So, and we're all good. You can see it's green, it finished. So this is the first step of adding a new palette to your runtime. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of this video is when you're on your Substrate node template code, you want to make sure that you're on the version that matches the dependency you're pulling in, okay? So if you take a look here, we're saying we're on Polkadot 0.9.28, right? So there is a tag with that name, and so you're going to want to go ahead and check that out. Like you can see here, I'm already on there. So you got this head detached at Polkadot 0.9.28. So if I do git check out this, right? I'm not, do it, but I'm already there. That's where you want to be before you actually start building, because you're going to want all the versions to line up. Now, the next step is to, and I see I already completed all these steps here. So the next step is to look at the config trait. So this is the config trait for the the Nix palette. So this is how they declared it. And actually this is a little bit different. So this event type is actually runtime event now. This is something they just changed, I think about a week and a half ago when I looked at the code. I think they haven't updated the tutorial yet. So maybe by the time you see this, this will be updated. But this is actually, instead of event, it's going to be runtime event, which is fine. But these are all the types or associated types that are defined for this config trait. And so a little bit about traits, I guess, is in order. So a trait is a way in Rust to define shared behavior for a component or object or code. So it's a way for us to describe what something does or what it can do. And then so that way, whoever is referencing that piece of code, knows that it can do these things, and it can call whatever functions or access whatever types based on this particular behavior or trait in this case. This is very similar to interfaces if you're coming from C# or from Java. There are some differences with traits, but for the most part, it's the same thing. And so one of the interesting things about traits is you can define these things called associated types, okay? That's where you see this type event, right? And then you see all of this stuff here, okay? Granted, I find the syntax, like I'm new to Rust. For me, the syntax is a little, it's a little much, but you get accustomed to it. It just takes time. So be patient with yourself and bear with it, and you'll start to be able to discern what some of this stuff is saying. But back to associated types, this is like a type placeholder. So when you're declaring the trait, you can say, you need to define a type which is called event, and this type needs to be, and this is the bounds for which it needs to be, for what the type needs to be. So what that means is for instance, let's use a simpler one here, currency, right? So this type is called currency. So when we implement the trait, right, this is the declaration. This is saying this is what the trait must be. It's kind of the blueprint or the schematic, right? And so then we actually have to go define concretely what the trait is going to be. And so when we do that, we have to, when we define currency, we have to define the concrete type as something that is a reservable currency, right? For like min length and max length, right? It has to be something that is an unsigned 32, right? So that's what is defined for the Nix palette. This one is pretty small and simple. And as you look at these config traits, you'll start to see a pattern of things that are very common. So like, for example, the next thing they ask you to do is take a look at the balances config trait, right? So this is not the declaration, but this is the implementation. So you see that here, right? So real quick above, you see this is pub for public trait config. And then down here is a implementation of the balances palette config for runtime, right? So for the config trait is defined in runtime, okay? So here you can see they've actually set these concrete types, right? So like max locks, right, is a constant unsigned 32 with a value of 50. So max locks actually gets the value of 50. Max reserved is the unit type. So basically that says that there's nothing there. Balance, you'll see here, this is actually a palette, which is defined in the runtime lib.rs file. Event, I think all of these traits have an event type. This is actually defined in the palette. These are the events that occur whenever something happens. And we can actually dig into that a little bit too. And as another example, existential deposit here is a constant unsigned 128 with a value of 500, right? So these are the concrete types that we're defining for these associated types. And just kind of a sidebar, these are a little bit like, you might be thinking, well, this sounds kind of like a generic that's available in other languages. Rust also has generics, which is a way for you to define something once that can be used across multiple types. And so it is like that in one way, but the difference is here we are not using this across multiple types. It's almost like we're kind of delaying the definition of what the concrete type will be until somebody goes ahead and implement it. And there's only one type used there. If you didn't understand any of that, don't worry. It's no big deal. As you get more into Rust, you'll come across generics. In fact, in the Rust book, there's a whole chapter on it. I suggest reading that if you're up to that level yet. But if you didn't understand any of that, don't worry. Just focus on the tutorial. We need to go define the actual types that we want to use on our Nix palette, and that's coming up next. So down here it's saying, okay, so now that you've seen what the Nix palette config trait is, and now you've seen an example of how one is implemented for the balances palette, now you're going to go implement it for the runtime palette. Okay, so that's what this is. So you see we have the impl here. So we're implementing this config trait for the runtime. And here it has you define the currency as balances. This is actually the balances palette that we actually looked at up above, and I can show you where that's actually defined in the code. There's a reservation fee, which is a const of unsigned 128 with a value of 100. Slashed, we don't do anything with slash, so we assign it the unit type. Force origin, so this is just saying that, hey, anybody who is going to run this force command, and there's actually this force operation, there's a force function in here. You have to be the root user, right? So that's what that's saying. And then you have min length and max length, which is 8 and 32 respectively. These are type of const unsigned 32. And then we have the event type. And again, this hasn't been updated yet, but they changed this to runtime event. I assume maybe because event is too general. I don't know, but I can show you where in the code that exists as well. In fact, let's take a look at it real quick, right? So back up here, if you scroll up, you'll see there's a link to the Rust documentation for the Nix palette. And then there's actual source code, right? So if we take a look at the source code real quick. Excuse me. So this is the Nix palette, right? And this is what we just looked at, right? So this is the declaration of the config trait. This is the event. Oh, and I just wanted to show you, right? So you see before it was event, now it's runtime event. So before it was type event, now it's runtime event. And so actually, if we just look at the commits real quick for that line. Sorry, I'm taking a little detour here, but hopefully this is interesting to you. I went a little bit too far. So yeah, on runtime here. 10 days ago, there's this breaking, rename, call, and event, right? So because they renamed this type, obviously that's going to break some people's stuff unless they go update the name. So that's why they put the breaking here. But yeah, so this just changed. So just something to be aware of. That this is going to change eventually, probably in this tutorial, and so you'll want to account for that. But our tutorial here will work just fine with the version we're on, so no need to worry about it. And real quick, while we're in here, I'll just show you quickly the function name. So this is the set name. Remember, we said there was 3 functions: set name, clear name, and I think it was kill name, right? So this is set name, right? And so set name you can see where it's actually raising these events, right? So it basically, if there's already a deposit, is saying, so basically you already have a name defined. So we're going to change the name and we're going to raise this name changed event, right? Over here, if there isn't a deposit already and we're just actually creating a name, then we'll do this name set event here. We'll do we'll reserve the deposit and then we'll raise this name set event. Okay, for clear name, at the end here, it does the name cleared event. And then kill name, the same thing. So you can see, here's the force name one. We don't actually do this in the tutorial, but it's there. Again, you see this ensure origin. So it's just making sure that you are the root user, that you're able to call this. And then it's actually doing this name force event. It's raising this at the end after it does its thing. And so you can see those event names up here, right? So this is the event concrete type that we're assigning to the event type here, right? Okay, so a little bit of a detour, but hopefully that was useful to you. So anyway, the last thing we need to do, so we got this, so we got this implementation for the config trait for Pallet's NICs. So we need to go over to the under Runtime and SRC. We want to click on lib.rs. Okay, and so I'm gonna go ahead and put this right here, right above construct runtime, just for convenience. So you want to copy this and paste this here. Okay, and then finally we need to add the pallet to the construct runtime macro, right? So this is the construct runtime macro. This is actually what builds the run, or creates what's going to actually be included in the runtime. And so we want to add the NICs pallet there, right? Okay, cool. So let's run our cargo check real quick just to make sure we're good and we didn't run into any problems before we start our build. And if this is all good, then we can run cargo build release. And then we're going to run the substrate node, and then we're going to fire up the front end, and then we'll do the NIC association, all that, so you can see how that works. And then we're done. All right, so while this is going, again, there, I went pretty quick, but let me run cargo build now since everything worked out. Cargo build, okay. And so while that's running, hopefully it won't, it's probably gonna take a little bit of time. So I might need to pause the video right here and then we'll resume when it comes back. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and let's start our substrate node. Okay. And now let's start our front end. So on our front end, we're going to run yarn start. And both of these instructions are here in the tutorial, right? So it's target release node template -- dev to start your substrate node, and then yarn start to start the front end. Okay. And now this is running. So here is our front end for our current chain. And we're going to go down to the pallet interactor, and we're going to select under pallets, we're going to select NICs. And then these callables are the different functions that are defined. So the first one we're going to define is set name. And we'll just give it a name. It says you can give it whatever name you want. It just has to be more than 8 characters and less than 32, right? So I think we're at, let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so, and then we're going to click signed. Okay, current transaction status ready. There's some activity you'll see going on over here in the output of your node. And then finally you see the events success. So first we withdrew the money, then we reserved it, then we set the name for the NIC, we paid the transaction fee, and we had a success message. Those are the different events that popped up. And so now what we can do, if we want to see, let's say we want to see what the name is for Alice, right? So we go down to NICs, we're going to copy Alice's address here, and we're going to paste it in here. I'm sorry, name of, there we go. Okay, so we select the name of query, and so we get this value, right? So this is a hex encoded value of the name. And so if you're on a Mac, if you're on Windows, I don't know what tool you'll need to use. You just go on the internet, but look for something that is a hex decoder. But on a Mac, you can use this command. So you can just echo the value and pipe it into XXD with this -R-P. And then you'll see the actual string value there. All right, so that's how you set the nickname. That's how you query it. There's some exploration of additional functions. We did some of that, actually looked at the code for some of that under the NICs palette. And then there is additional steps down here. So that's it for this tutorial. The next time we'll go over one of these tutorials down here. We'll kind of take a logical progression through the tutorials to get you more familiar with Substrate. I think I'm going to stick with Substrate for a while, just because I'm very interested in it, and it seems like there's some interest out there for it too. So we'll spend a little bit more time here, then we'll check out some of the other chains that are using Rust. But yeah, I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope this was useful. I hope it was helpful to you. And I hope there was enough here that allowed you to understand how to add a pallet to the runtime, how to build your Substrate node, and how to interact with the pallet using the front end. And then also some details about Rust that maybe you didn't know, or at least maybe you weren't that familiar with, that you can go ahead and dig into further on your own time. So if you got any questions, leave them in the comments below. Please subscribe. I will be creating more videos here more often. I took a little bit of a break, but now I'm back. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy.